If you haven't spent much time in the North Pacific, you won't know much about our newest deputy speaker, Kashovia, also known as Cash. But while he only recently became active again, he actually has a long history in the North Pacific, having served as Minister of Communications and as Vice Delegate. As any modern minister worth their salt knows, Cash has had an incredible impact on the Ministry of Communications, and his influence continues to be felt to this day. Welcome to the show, Cash.
Hello. It's good to be on the show.
We're glad to have you. I think it's probably best if we start at the beginning, because most people don't know your background. Could you talk about what got you into nation states and what led you to joining the North Pacific?
So a couple of years ago, over 3 years ago now, as anyone interested in politics does, looks for games related to the subject. And obviously, in my case, it was controlling a country and dealing with, being a leader of a country. And in that search, I came across nation states. And for the better part of 2015, actually, I just created a few nations just to test the game out, see what a few communities were doing. And it kind of left my mind. But actually, about 7 or 8 years ago, I did visit the site and create a nation. But back then, I, again, lost interest. It was only in April of 2016 that I revisited the site and decided to create Kashovia. And the funny thing is, I actually was spawned in the East Pacific. So I sometimes think how everything would have panned out differently had I had stayed there. But I think I joined the North Pacific an hour or so after, creating the nation, just because of how many nations were there. The North Pacific, even today, has the most nations. And I just thought that was cool. So I thought there'd be a lot of activity there. And yeah, I joined the MPA first, actually, as soon as I got on the forums. And I think it all just went from there, really.
So you were part of the MPA for something like 8 months, right? What was your most memorable time during that period? When, was it the officer test or any particular operation?
Oh yes, definitely the officer test. I had absolutely zero experience with the R&D gameplay, so to get into that straight away pretty early on was very nerve-wracking, especially with Gladio as Minister of Defense. He was really helpful, and one of the main reasons I joined the MPA was because of how much I looked up to him in terms of his activity and things like that. But yeah, the officer test, definitely the most memorable. Just trying to find the right region, timings, everything. It was very, very stressful, but worth it once I, passed. And now eventually I'm a lieutenant, so,
Yeah. So over the course of your time in the North Pacific Army, you gained lots of experience, I'm sure. Do you think it was that made you stand out the most, or was it something else in your early days in the North Pacific that ended up getting you a minister position?
I think it wasn't necessarily the North Pacific Army that made me stand out, as there were a lot of people doing what I was doing back then in terms of joining, getting that first operation out of the way, meeting new people, things like that. A lot of people were doing that back then. I think what made me stand out was I instantly messaged Lord Ravenclaw and asked him basically, what can I do? How can I, help around here? Like, what do people get into when they're new here? And straight away, I saw that he was offering people, their positions, as I think he was just elected delegate. And I saw that he had offered Minister of Gameside Affairs as a position and was asking for applications. And I applied straight away and had so many ideas. I think I messaged him 5 ideas a day about what I wanted to see in the region, what I thought would be a cool idea to try. And I must have sounded pretty ridiculous, but I think it paid off.
Yeah, so was was the Gameside Affairs Ministry much like what we now have as the Gameside Advocates, or was it a different role?
I think so. Yeah, I think it was very similar in terms of the Gameside Advocates now in TMP. But yeah, as we were talking earlier before the interview, I genuinely did not really know what Lord Ravenclaw wanted from me in terms of what the vision was. I kind of had an idea that it was to unite the forums and the game side of the North Pacific, but in general terms, I was just gaining that experience of, what ideas I wanted to see, or all that kind of thing. So it wasn't like I was completely confident in what the ministry was there for, but I knew that was the general idea. So I did as best as I could, and that experience really paid off, I think.
Yeah, so just so that we give listeners a general idea, you first served in the NPA directly after joining the North Pacific, and then about a month after joining, you said you became appointed Gameside Affairs Minister, and that was a term that you served for like 4 months, right?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I do remember there being 2 terms somewhere in my memory, but it was so long ago now, I couldn't be confident.
Sure. Okay. So you served, 1 or 2 terms then as Gameside Affairs Minister, and then following that, what was your next step in the North Pacific?
So after the Minister of Gameside Affairs was deleted or abolished as a ministry, it became more about what I really enjoyed in nation states. I wasn't really looking for a position of, power or, too much responsibility. So I started working in the Ministry of Communications, which of course has now become, a ministry that I really love to work in and love to manage because I love writing. That was the main reason I joined it, because authors were needed, things like that. So I started writing. I started picking up loads of these responsibilities for writing articles after articles after articles. And I was appointed as Minister of Communications. I'm not exactly sure. I could probably look it up. I don't really keep track of like what month I was appointed or anything. But I remember it being quite soon after the Ministry of Gameside Affairs was abolished. And then from there, obviously, that was the next step. And I think in communications, there was that instant, like, just enjoyment for what was going on there. So,
why do you think the Ministry of Gameside Affairs was abolished?
I don't think that there was much. There wasn't much clarity around what exactly the ministry was aiming to do. So I think Home Affairs actually picked up the mantle in terms of Gameside Affairs. When we talk about getting people from nation states onto the forums and into the community, I think Home Affairs served that purpose way better than the Ministry of Gameside Affairs did. And, keeping open communication with people who, most likely will stay on the game side instead of, coming over to the forums. That then became the role of the Gameside Advocates. So, yeah.
After becoming appointed Minister of Communications, I looked back at some of the articles that you wrote over the course of those terms and saw that your term in office saw some of the longest and most thoroughly written issues of the Northern Light. How were you able to achieve that kind of success while you were minister?
I think it's, well, firstly, I was very passionate about the role, and I didn't want my, legacy being in communications to be one of, constant delays and not getting issues out and things like that. And I will admit, when I first became Minister of Communications, it wasn't as, active and as lengthy as you might think. I think it was more to do with establishing that framework of the articles that we wanted to see, such as the RA highlights and the World Assembly Digest and the MPA Bulletin, just giving people outside the North Pacific an idea of what we did inside the region. And obviously the Spotlight interviews were a great feature. I love to do them every single time we released an issue. I really like talking to people in the North Pacific, and I think it was more just about establishing that foundation, which of course led to more activity in the ministry, because people knew what kind of articles needed to be written. And now today it's been split and obviously rebranded as the North Star, which I think was the most appropriate action for it. But yeah, I think that it was more to do with getting those basic articles down, increasing activity, so people could see that the Ministry of Communications wasn't inactive as it used to be over the last few years before I served.
One of the things when I took over as Minister of Communications was that while there was a really good framework for articles for the Northern Light, which were, as you mentioned, the RA highlights and the WA Digest and the NPA Bulletin, it had become so segmented that basically people were not really putting in the effort anymore to really give those an actual highlight. They were just, very briefly summarizing things. And so when I took over, I wasn't exactly sure what to do at first. And I, tried to increase the standards of those different sections, but there was so much stagnation within the ministry at that point that it became clear that larger change was needed. So you mentioned, that you think it's appropriate for it to have been segmented off sort of as the North Star, but the North Star is simply a continuation of, the Northern Lights, just under a different name. What do you think of what I've done with the Northern Light and sort of the much longer, more thorough articles that, while they don't have that basic framework, can be quite interesting?
I love the work that you've done in the Ministry of Communications during your time. It really is refreshing to see that new design. And that was what I was aiming for when I was Minister of Communications. I just didn't have the graphical skill or the knowledge of how to create such thorough newspaper-looking media. And I think that is one of my biggest regrets about my time as Minister of Communications, is that I didn't see how much better. I knew that it would be much better than what we were producing. It's just I didn't have that ability back then. And now, obviously, with you posting these amazing tutorials and these templates for creating that media, it really has pushed the ministry into its next era. And that's very impressive to me. And a credit to every single author who puts in that effort to write their articles, because there's only so much you can talk about with nation states, but I'm surprised every single time new fresh articles are written.
Well, I thank you for the credit you've given me, but I'm going to be somewhat more candid, I would say, during this interview than I will be or have been in the past with other people I've interviewed and spoken to. And that's because this episode will be released in a few days. And could you share with us the news that Mick Macedonia shared with you this morning?
Yeah, so I'm actually very excited to say that I am now, as you're hearing this, Minister of Communications following Macedonia's appointment of myself. So I'm very happy with it, and I can't wait to get to work.
Well, I will congratulate you on your appointment, and it's going to be great to see you as Minister of Communications again. But in your role, I will warn you, the Northern Light, while we sometimes make it look easy, really has become very challenging as a result of the changes that I made to it. And you mentioned the tutorials that I've made for NBS. over the last few days, which is really more of an experience that I've learned from my time as Minister of Communications, because what I have found is that by pushing the limit on what those articles can be, and by creating what many have called, brilliant formatting for them, I fear that in so doing, I have created a newspaper that is unsustainable. That, after I leave nation states, that the progress that we have made on it will fall behind, and deteriorate once more. And to some extent, that's, we need to have clear standards for what we're looking for in articles, and be able to relay that to the rest of the staff of the ministry so that people know what's going on. And then the second thing would be to sort of redo those tutorials for formatting and make sure that it's accessible for everyone. And that's something that I still have to work on, and is sort of my greatest regret for my time in office.
Yeah. I mean, I do completely understand where you're coming from. The standard of the Northern Light now is very high, but I do think with 4 months to produce each edition, it's not a with your. I think have you posted I remember reading a tutorial on how to produce the Northern Light. You've created that, haven't you?
I have, but it didn't seem to be particularly useful to previous ministers, such as Ghost, who relied on my skills to do the formatting last term. And at the end of last term, we found that the last Northern Lights issue, which would be issue 30 that we were working on, came up short on authors. We only currently have one author prepared, I think, and there's several articles that are sort of pending, but the issue has now been delayed into this term as a result of that. And I also wanted to say, at this point, it might be more likely that we end up publishing once every 4 months. But during my terms and during Ghost's term, the goal was always to get out 2 issues of the Northern Light per term, so once every 2 months, which is a pretty strict turnaround rate.
Yeah, I do agree with that. But I think if I play my cards right and learn the right things, I can definitely get used to the workload of finding authors and things like that, and 2, I think I can pick up the formatting and templating and the style of the Northern Light right now. So I don't see that as an issue. What I do see as an issue, of course, is finding those people to write the type of articles that deserve to be in that production. So I think that will be the problem that I'll face, but I'm sure we'll get around it somehow.
Yeah, I'm actually really encouraged by your confidence in that area, because you've always been sort of a get it done sort of an individual, and you work hard, and you have a strong, work ethic in trying to make sure that you get the job done right, and you get it done as swiftly as possible, and that sets you up very well for success in the term. And if at any point you need help, you can always ask myself or Ghost or McMasterdonia about anything that you need. And as far as getting authors goes, one thing that we've noticed is that getting authors within the Ministry of Communications has proven an impossibility. And you can sometimes get 1 or 2 people from within the ministry to write an article, but more often than not, you have to reach wider throughout all of the North Pacific, and even to some of our allies abroad. And that requires some knowledge of foreign affairs and whatnot. And so that's why Ghost and McMasterdonia serve us very well.
Yeah, I think in terms of finding people in the broader spectrum of potential writers in the North Pacific, one thing I could say is that it generally doesn't require that much incentive to get people to write if you know what those people want to write about and are genuinely passionate about. So, as an example, the nation states cards have been, massive in the nation states community recently, and a lot of people are quite invested in them, even leading to a condemnation recently. So I think with that, an article was written in the last Northern Light about those cards, and people are very passionate about them. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily that hard to find people to write if they're passionate about what they're writing about. But if you try and force people to write about things they're not really interested in just for the sake of writing an article, that could definitely lead to some stagnation.
One of the things that we've been doing with the newspaper is that each issue has a theme, which has helped us and hurt us in some ways. In one sense, it gives us a really good baseline to figure out what sort of people we should be asking to write articles. It keeps it interesting and new for people reading the newspaper. But at the same time, if we're limited to the same people that we're asking each time, at some point one of them isn't going to be passionate about a given subject. And so we have to always reach a little wider with each issue. And so that's always a challenge.
Yeah.
What I did want to get back to, though, was some of your history in the game. We didn't cover your term as a vice delegate. When did that fit in your history? Was it after your terms as Minister of Communications or before them? And what sort of campaign did you run?
So for vice delegate, that position's one that I am very proud of. Not for the work that I did, but I'm more proud of myself for that, because I did start to get, I felt like being Minister of Communications, as much as I loved it, would become one of those positions for me where nothing would be done in terms of progress. I was happy to release the Northern Light every month with the standard that the North Star has currently. But I just wanted a change, and I wanted to, kind of take a step up in terms of responsibility and really gain more confidence speaking to other people from other branches of the region, such as security. And I was speaking, I was talking to Indie Girl, which has been a member for over a decade now, and was around when TMP was couped. And she was telling me in our Spotlight interview about fighting back against the coup. I can't recall the exact event, but it just made me think about where security was in the region and if it could happen. And I never want the community to go through a terrible coup, and as safe as the region is, you never know. People are always coming up with new ways to do damage. So that was the decision of mine, just to get more involved in an area that I was uncomfortable with, which is also what I'm doing now with the Deputy Speaker position, because I'm very uncomfortable with general knowledge of the laws and practices of the Regional Assembly. I haven't really been active in the Regional Assembly in the past. I think Vice Delegate was a way for me to gain more confidence and explore a new area of the region that I otherwise wouldn't have.
You ran on a campaign to increase representation for Security Council members and provide more opportunities for Keepers of the North, as well as maintaining that security that is so important for the delegacy and for the region. And you're, as you said, very proud of the work that you did during that term. And of course, these sort of security challenges are ever present, despite the fact that we have, made a lot of progress in the last few years. To what extent do you still see these challenges as something that we face today?
I think that the challenges that we could potentially face have been massively limited in terms of possibility by the World Assembly Development Programme, just due to the sheer size of nations and the number of nations we've currently got, obviously endorsing our World Assembly delegate. I think it would be pretty impossible to ever coup the region in terms of endorsements or in terms of R&D gameplay, but there is always the the risk that somebody could infiltrate the delegacy position and say that they had good intentions. But then I also consider that we do have one of the oldest and containing the most influential nations in the Security Council. So unless somebody could manage to, find a way to reduce those institutions, I don't think a coup could ever happen. I don't think those risks are currently present. Like I said, somebody would need to find a very new way of causing damage.
I'm tempted to ask you how you would coup, but at the same time, I don't want to broadcast that sort of information to everyone abroad. So I guess I'll just ask you about that later.
I think McMacedonia actually made an excellent post in his campaign thread about how he would go about a coup of the North Pacific. And I think most of us would probably like to think that we would have the capability to follow those kind of, very sneaky, very well-planned steps. But I would never, ever dream of coupping the North Pacific.
Of course not, neither would I. But as a member of the Security Council, it makes sense to sort of think of these sort of possibilities so that you're able to plan for them and have, steps that you can take to counter these sort of moves, which is sort of why I keep asking people.
And I think that's a credit to McMacedonia, because he is clearly very, very aware of the threats that could arise, having made that post in so much detail. And I'm very comfortable in the fact that we have a very capable, historically, and very aware delegate as it stands.
So at what point over the last few years you left the game for some time? What caused you to leave nation states, and what influenced your decision to return?
In one word, exams. Yeah. Real life always has its ways of interrupting the things that you genuinely enjoy. But I think I turned out okay. I got some good results. I'm currently starting my A-levels. So part of the reason I returned to nation states was because I have a lot more time now at the end of my days to come on nation states, talk to people, do some work, and just chill out, really. And I think with some things in life, you always go back to them, be it, a musician or be it a game. You always have that connection to something. And I think nation states is that thing, because I've been, in nation states for a lot of time now, many years. So it's hard to just up and leave, really. I had to come back at some point.
I think that's true for all of us. We're stuck here forever.
Exactly.
But now that you're back, do you plan on sticking around? I mean, you're going to be Minister of Communications, but how long do you think that sort of second segment of your career will last?
It will last probably up until I'm halfway through my second year. So I've got 2 years of A-levels now. And that second half of next year will be very, very hard in terms of content, in terms of work that I have to do. But I want to get as much work done and as much progress as I can while I have the time. And then once A-levels are done, I should be off to university, and I will have a lot more time for nation states at that point, I think.
So, as we've mentioned, you've just been appointed Minister of Communications. What do you see as your plans and goals now that you're back? Now you've become a minister again. Do you see yourself going higher in TNP leadership?
I think every member of the North Pacific imagines what their delegacy would look like. But right now, I'm really in no position to dream of such leadership. But in terms of the Ministry of Communications, um, in all honesty, my goal is to follow in your footsteps in terms of the quality of work that happens and the quality of work that is produced. So that's my main goal in this first term. And then if I stay on for a second term, it will be about what direction I believe the ministry needs to go in. And I'll do my damn hard that that happens.
It's great to see a legend return. I mean, now that you're back, can we expect Frozen Top Hat and Scorch as well?
Oh, I don't know. It's been a while. I mean, me and Frozen Top Hat, we go back a long time. He was one of the first people I ever spoke to in the North Pacific. If I remember correctly, it was something about formatting dispatches in BB code and whatever. But we started the Northern Broadcasting Service together because we knew that, regions such as Europea had done such things. I honestly don't know if he will come back to activity, but when he does, he can be sure to get a long-awaited greeting from me. And as for Scorch, he's done really great work in the executive staff before. I just don't know how, real life for any of these people is going. But I would love to see them back. I really would.
You mentioned founding NBS. As I recall, you did so with the help of Bootsy and Tomb, Frozen Top Hat, as we mentioned, Scorch, Darkania, Yalkan, and Aragnatum. And I've actually gone back and I've listened to every single one of the old NBS shows. And I used that as like the inspiration to get me started doing news shows for NBS again and trying to revitalize that program. But, as much as I really enjoyed those time capsules, almost, so to speak, from our region's past, I've always wondered, how was it like to organize NBS? Because you were, one of the founding members. What sort of was I don't think I ever heard you in one of the shows, but you must have had a hand.
Yeah. So back when the Northern Broadcasting Service was still part of the Ministry of Communications and not as part of a separate ministry, I think it was the minister's duty to organize the NBS with obviously the help of those interested. And I think usually how it would go is I'd start a thread asking for topics, asking for thoughts on what the next one should be, especially if it was around an election or anything important happening. Pretty usual, just coming up with topics. And then obviously back then I was far too intimidated by recording my own voice. So I never got involved, but I'd heard a lot of the speakers back then before. So it was more a case of finding people comfortable with talking and having their voices recorded and published. And the planning was very similar, if not the exact same as it is now. I think one thing I'm very happy about with what the Northern Broadcasting Service is doing is asking questions of people after the broadcasts are published, which is something that I hadn't ever considered. So I'll definitely be implementing that within publishing the Northern Light and the North Star and things like that.
That's actually a good idea that I hadn't thought of for the Ministry of Communications. You'd think that, having switched over to radio and having these ideas here, I would have translated it back, but that's actually brilliant.
Well, it's great. It really is great work that the Ministry of Radio, even this early in the term, has managed to pull off. Mostly with you as the main source of this work, but I will definitely be involved in the Ministry of Radio in the future, which I look forward to a lot. So yeah, that is definitely part of my plans, to seek people's feedback and their thoughts after every edition of the Northern Light. So
I'm glad that you like the progress that I've made. One of the things that I knew when I started this was that it would take a lot of startup work from me, but that I also needed to do it very quickly because I sort of, as a new ministry, I felt the need to make sure that we have to prove that it's worth having this exist, and we have to prove that we're going to be active. And at the beginning, I knew that I'd be one of the few people involved, so I have to be the one to make it happen. And now that sort of initial setup stuff is behind us, I'm really hoping that by doing a lot of these broadcasts, we can get more people involved. And I'm glad to hear that you're going to be along for that ride.
Definitely, yeah. It's very communications related work that I like doing. And we haven't touched upon this, but my time as Minister of Foreign Affairs was really a wake-up call for me in terms of how greater nation-states gameplay really works, and how much work can be required to establish those connections between regions. And my time there is not something I remember as being, effective or as a positive time, but I do look at it in the sense that I gained a lot of skills and a lot of experience from taking that criticism from people, which allowed me to, even today, pursue ideas and that hard work that otherwise I wouldn't.
I'm glad you brought up your term as Minister of Foreign Affairs, because despite doing a little bit of research last night, I actually didn't know you'd ever served in the position, so I didn't ask you about it.
Yes, I did. I think it was under either Plembobria or Lord Ravenclaw. I'm honestly not confident. It was a very long time ago, and it's something that I don't necessarily want to recall.
All right, well, we won't speak about it too much then, but I'm getting somewhat confused. Could you sort of reiterate very briefly the timeline from, starting off in the North Pacific, and what, you don't have to say what month it was, but sort of the sequence of what positions you were in, because now I'm starting to wonder if you've been a minister of anything else.
I mean, it is very hard to recall exactly. I've got I had a dispatch posted some time ago on my nation about the different time periods and whatnot, but I think it went Minister of Gameside Affairs, Minister of Communications, and then once I was somewhat done in terms of what I wanted to achieve in my terms as Minister of Communications, I was looking at different ministries, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was an area that, of course, I was uncomfortable in. So I wanted to take that responsibility and learn. As anyone who wants to get better at something, if you're uncomfortable with it, you have to do it. Which is why I'm doing this broadcast, because I've never wanted to be part of a broadcast, or I just didn't feel comfortable with it. And that was how I saw the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But after that, then it was Vice Delegate, I believe. And then now Deputy Speaker. I have served in other small roles like Home Affairs Foreign Mentor, Gameside Advocate. I think I was lead Gameside Advocate at one point, and Deputy Attorney General. I've been Deputy Minister of every ministry by now, I think. And the North Pacific Army has always been in the background in some kind of way. So I think that's the chronology of it. But I could be wrong.
I probably should have started with that question. So having served in so many different parts of the North Pacific in so many different roles, what would you say is your favorite part of the North Pacific?
I think my favorite part of the North Pacific is definitely the community. and the way that people interact with each other, and this shared love of, I think a lot of it is to do with just wanting to escape from, the responsibility. I mean, for me at least, it's just wanting to escape from the responsibilities of real life and whatnot. So nation states in the North Pacific was a great way for me to do that. Specifically, I would say just seeing how people talk to each other, talking to people, is my favorite part, I would say.
Is there anything that you would like to see improved about, life here in the North Pacific?
We are doing very well as it is, but I'm not sure, in all honesty. I'm really, off the top of my head, I'm really not sure what could be done to make anything in general better, because a lot of things we do a lot better than a lot of other regions, such as World Assembly involvement, and security and activity a lot, and role play. Our role play scene is amazing. So I really couldn't tell you. I would have to think about it very hard.
I just went looking for that dispatch that you said about, different positions in the North Pacific. And while I couldn't find it, you just mentioned role play, and I saw that there's quite a number of dispatches about the Northern Cup in 2016 and 2017. What was your role in that?
Yeah. That is a very fond memory in nation states, with Mad Jack and Highton helping me out a lot with that. I think it was. I'm very into football, and being from the UK. So the Northern Cup was a massive event for me. There was a lot to organise and get done, but I love being in the thick of projects and getting things done. And I think I vaguely remember, was it you that ran some kind of footballing event or something like that in nation states?
I mean, I have, but it wasn't in the North Pacific.
Yeah. I do remember it was like involving multiple regions, was it?
I think I did, yeah.
Yeah, and that was actually what inspired me. I think it was before I did it. I couldn't tell you. I'm not 100% confident, but I think it was before I ran the Northern Cup. I'm not 100% sure, but I remember that being what inspired me. Like, hang on a minute, why haven't we had a Northern Cup event similar?
Well, I'd be very surprised if it was, to be honest, because I just can't imagine anyone having heard of that. The one that I ran was really not a very successful event, to the best of my memory. But I was trying to dabble in that side of nation states with the sort of sports role play, and it's not something I've ever really come back to because I don't know, I didn't like it as much as most people did. But it's really shocking to me that you somehow picked up on that.
I did. I remember it very well, actually. I was in awe of how many different, groups and how many different matches were simulated and kept track of and things like that. I love that kind of work. So, and I love that side of nation states. And of course, it's in a lot better hands now in the North Pacific, especially with the current role play scene. There's so many different branches of role play. It's great to see different people, especially different maps now and different worlds. I've seen, is it Strange Reel?
Yep.
Yeah, and Aeneas. I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Or is it, yeah. All these different role play worlds is very. The role play scene has come a long way. But yeah, the sports side is a lot better handled than I ever could handle it.
So do you remain interested in roleplay to this day?
Yes, yeah, of course I do. Which is why I've recently just restarted Cashovia's history and rewritten it. So yeah, I'm going to be working on that a bit on the side.
Well, we're very glad to have you back, and it's wonderful to see that you've got plans to stick around and that you have an interest in continuing service in the Executive Council and pursuing, progress for our region's future. So that's something that I think our listeners will be very interested in. And I want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be a part of the show and to talk about the history that you have here on Nation States. Do you have anything else that you want to add before we finish up?
I'm very happy that I've decided to do this broadcast because it is one of those things that you're nervous about or you're not quite sure. But I am definitely confident now that the Ministry of Radio is in very good hands, and I can't wait to work on more broadcasts like this in the future.
Well, thank you so much, and you're definitely welcome to do so. Well, we'll wrap things up here and now, so enjoy your evening, and I'll talk to you later.
You too. Yep.